Welcome back to the IEA's podcast, Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. This week, we're looking at what the energy crisis means for people across Southeast Asia. The crisis in the Middle East is now into its fifth week, and the key problem for energy markets remains the disruption to oil and gas flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Around 60% of crude oil consumed across Southeast Asia comes from the Middle East, and 1/5 of its natural gas. With those flows cut off, energy prices across the region have risen sharply. But how is this energy crisis playing out in daily lives, and how are governments responding? Joining me today is someone who works with countries across Southeast Asia, Sue-Ern Tan, head of the IEA's Regional Cooperation Centre in Singapore. Sue-Ern Tan, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, we're looking across Asia in this podcast, but we want to start by reminding ourselves of the impact energy crises can have on emerging and developing economies, because the reality is the most vulnerable groups are often the hardest hit.
Yeah, that's right, Dan. Indeed, energy crises tend to hit import-dependent and developing economies the hardest. And it is important that we consider the impacts on ordinary people, on their day-to-day lives, both in terms of the energy impacts, such as the price of fuel, but also the food impacts. And we're seeing that very clearly across Asia today, particularly in Southeast Asia and South Asia. So let me share a few examples. In the Philippines, there are jeepney drivers, and these are both a cultural icon and really form the backbone of public transportation for many Filipinos. They've reported their daily income has collapsed by as much as 5 times due to diesel price spikes. Now, while the Philippines government has provided cash handout support to drivers, if diesel prices continue to rise, drivers will continue to struggle to make a living income, including, for example, even making enough money just to cover the boundary, which is the amount they pay to as a rent hire to the jeepney owners. If we look at Thailand, they have a multi-billion-dollar farming industry. It's worth about USD 4 billion a year in exports for Thailand. That industry is impacted by the cost of fuel rising because they need the fuel to keep their water pumps running, as well as rising cost of fertilizer. Now, as one of the world's largest rice exporter to multiple markets, including the US, Middle East, and South Africa, having this rising cost of fuels and the rising cost of fertilizer really does have broader impacts for the national economy of Thailand, as well as related industries. Now, the Thai government has recently rolled out a 1,400 baht subsidy per farmer, provided some discounts on chemical and organic fertilizers. But again, these provide temporary support, and our prolonged supply disruption could have broader impacts. And finally, I just want to touch on South Asia. If we look across Bangladesh and Pakistan, we're seeing long queues at fuel stations due to supply shortages. We've got schools and universities being closed to conserve electricity and fuel. So these are not abstract macroeconomic impacts, but real immediate changes to people's daily lives.
So tell me about Southeast Asia's energy mix. Where do countries in the region get their energy from?
Fossil fuels dominate the overall energy mix in Southeast Asia. Oil accounts for about 30% of total energy demand, making it the single largest source. We then have coal at around 28%, and then natural gas at about 20%. If we zoom in just on the electricity sector, coal provides nearly half of the region's electricity. It's the backbone of power systems in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and in Vietnam. Natural gas is the main electricity source in several economies. If we look at Singapore, it generates about 94% of its electricity from imported LNG. If we look at Brunei Darussalam, about 80% of its electricity mix is from natural gas, and in Thailand, it's around 64%. There is a presence of renewables in the region, but it still makes up a relatively small share, with wind and solar contributing around 4.5% in the overall electricity mix as of 2025. So Southeast Asia really does rely on fossil fuels for its energy, and much of that is imported. So that's why if you've got any oil or gas supply disruption, whether it's from geopolitics or market volatility, it translates very quickly into economic and energy security risks for the region.
Now, how dependent is the region on the energy products that come through the Strait of Hormuz?
Asia and Southeast Asia is more exposed than other regions to disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, and therefore the crisis is being felt more immediately and intensely across the region. Now, this is because the region relies heavily on seaborne oil and LNG with limited alternatives such as pipelines. So about 80% of oil and oil products transiting the Strait in 2025 was destined for Asia. So, for example, about half of Malaysia's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. And if we look at LNG, the exposure is even greater. Nearly 90% of LNG via the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia. China is the largest recipient by volume, but South Asia, Chinese Taipei, and Singapore have far higher shares of imports and consumption coming through the Strait. In Southeast Asia, besides Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines are the main LNG importers via the Strait of Hormuz and are increasingly vulnerable the longer the strait remains constrained. Now, we have seen some supply-side responses, with cargoes being rerouted from Europe to Asia, attracted by the higher price premium in Asia, but not every country has the financial means to compete for those cargoes.
Okay, so this is a supply-side shock, and we know the role the IEA has played to help the supply of oil, and by that I mean coordinating the release of those 400 million barrels of oil from emergency reserves. But how have the supply issues played out in the region?
Yes, well, given the region's exposure to oil flows from the Strait of Hormuz, any extra oil in the market to provide comfort on supply pressure helps. So, for example, as the IEA's announcement of the release of the 400 million barrels of emergency stock was welcomed by the Thailand, Vietnam, and Singapore governments. In Southeast Asia, individual countries are rolling out their own emergency measures. So, for example, the Philippines last week declared a national energy emergency and has launched a strategic fuel program targeting up to 2 million additional barrels of supply. In Thailand, we've seen the government order the restart of 2 decommissioned units at the Mae Moi coal-fired plant to add an additional 600 megawatt capacity back into the system. We've also seen some deeper cooperation with different partnering countries. So Singapore and Australia are accelerating negotiations on a new arrangement for essential supplies, including diesel, LNG, and other critical fuels. Singapore and Japan signed an agreement on the 15th of March to expand collaboration across LNG, hydrogen, ammonia, and the grid. And then you saw Thailand and Japan also renew their LNG and energy security partnerships to reinforce the supply routes and storage capability. We've also seen some regional solidarity actions. So Vietnam, for example, committed to supply 50 million litres of fuel to Lao PDR, recognizing its neighbours' limited refining capacity and growing vulnerability. And Thailand, despite tightening its own export controls, has exempted Lao PDR and Myanmar from fuel and LNG export ban, again to ensure that essential supply continues. So that level of cooperation between the countries in the region is continuing.
Okay, now we spoke in our last podcast about the way that countries are trying to change the way they use energy, really to help cushion the blow of price rises. But perhaps we could just remind ourselves of the actions that have been taken on the demand side already.
Yeah, as our executive director has said, this is the largest supply disruption in history. But supply-side measures alone cannot offset the scale of the disruption, and addressing the demand is a critical and immediate tool to reduce the pressure consumers have by improving affordability and also, importantly, supporting energy security. What we've seen in the region here from the governments is really some of the fastest demand-side measures in the world. Again, a reflection of Southeast Asia's exposure. The responses to the government in the regions really fall in 4 main areas. So first, governments moved quickly to cushion consumers from the price shock. We saw Indonesia budget roughly 380 trillion rupiah, which is about more than 20 billion USD, for energy subsidies. We've also seen Thailand and Vietnam tapping their fuel fund to provide subsidies. Second, we saw a rapid development of demand-side actions across the region, all closely in line with the IEA's 10 recommended measures for sheltering consumers and businesses from oil shocks. So, for example, Philippines and Myanmar have moved to a 4-day work week for government employees. Indonesia, Laos, PDR, Thailand, and Vietnam have all encouraged remote working and limited all official travel to cut fuel use. Lao PDR has cut their school days from 5 to 3 days. And Myanmar has introduced alternate driving days with even number plates on even dates and odd plates on odd dates. Third, inflation-related actions have been taken. Thailand issued some urgent orders to prevent hoarding and price manipulation of goods with penalties that include up to 10 years in prison. And the Philippine Central Bank will consider raising interest rates if oil prices stay above $100 for an extended period and the US dollar continues to strengthen. And then finally, countries are also dealing with knock-on effects, especially on farming and food supply. We've seen early actions taken by the Philippines government with fertilizer and rice support, again, to protect the farmers and to protect fishermen from a second wave of cost pressures. I would note that overall, the speed and intensity of these actions are linked to each country's level of exposure. And so some of the more dependent economies like the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam are really taking some very active intervention steps because they feel the shock first and hardest.
Yes, and I think it's interesting that a lot of countries you've mentioned didn't necessarily have the time to wait and see. They acted very quickly. Now, what lessons did the region learn from COVID and the energy crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022? And by that, I really mean, in what ways is the region in a better place to deal with this shock as opposed to the other disruptions that we've seen?
That's right, Daniel. I think the region has learned some hard lessons from COVID-19 and again during the 2022 energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We've seen countries in the region putting efforts to diversify their energy supply, particularly with homegrown energy resources like renewable energy. They're also investigating, for example, the role for nuclear energy. If I look just at renewable energy first, we've seen many countries setting very ambitious renewable energy targets in their power development plans. So, for example, Indonesia's latest power development plan, which is known as the RUPTL, has raised the renewable share in the power mix to 21% by 2030, led by solar capacity, really increasing at 40% and backed by hydropower. Indonesia is also investigating increasing battery capacity, which will be a key element to providing security for their electricity supply. If we look at Vietnam, they've got a renewable energy target of up to 36% by 2030, and they're expected to add about 40 gigawatts of renewable capacity up to 2030, led by wind and solar PV. In the Philippines, we've seen them set a 10-year green energy auction program, which aims to offer at least 25 gigawatts of renewable energy. And then right here in Singapore, we've got targets of around 6 gigawatts of low-carbon electricity imports by 2035, which should meet around one-third of the estimated future demand. Now, key to achieving these renewable energy plans and targets is development of the grid infrastructure. And we need to remember that grid infrastructure takes much longer to plan, permit, and complete compared to renewable projects, roughly 15 years versus, say, 1 to 5 years for a renewable generation project. So that timely action in terms of grid reinforcement and modernization is really critical for the region's energy security and that of individual countries. And we're seeing governments turning their attention to that now.
Finally, I want to end by talking about energy security. So what does this crisis tell us about the ways the region and perhaps the world more generally needs to think about energy security right now?
Yeah, well, I would refer back to the IEA's executive director's 3 golden rules of the energy security, which was mentioned back in 2025 at our first global summit on energy security hosted by the UK and the IEA. And that is diversification, predictability of the policy and regulatory context, and cooperation. So let me start with diversification. The governments in the region here have already been focusing, as I've said, on increasing renewables deployment, and that will continue as there will be a preference for homegrown domestic resources. There is a 20 terawatt technical potential of solar and wind in Southeast Asia, which is roughly 55 times the region's current generating capacity. If we could tap into this potential, as well as battery technology and investment potentially in nuclear as well, all of this will help play a part in enhancing energy security because it provides more diversity in energy supply sources. I also want to mention the importance of cooperation, not just in crisis moments, but more broadly. So the initiatives like the ASEAN Power Grid, which has a vision to connect the electricity networks of the ASEAN member states, remain critical to enable countries to connect low-cost generation with demand, enhance system flexibility, and share resources. So that provides a regional energy security. Now, we've seen very strong political momentum for the development of the ASEAN Power Grid, including an enhanced MOU, which was agreed to last year by the Ministers for Energy, as well as a financing initiative supported by the ADB and World Bank. And now the focus really is on how do we turn that momentum into implementation and more projects. So the next few years really will be critical to translate this momentum into investment and implementation. And the IEA here in the region through the Regional Cooperation Center, but also with our colleagues in Paris, really want to continue to collaborate with governments in the region, as well as our other partners to support the delivery of such an important initiative.
Okay, Sue-Ern Tan, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.